in the course of the story. And in the middle, the meat or the peanut butter, whatever it is you like for your sandwich, the story within the story is the story of the woman who had a bleeding disorder. Now, why does Mark tell stories like this? The reason, I think, is because he wants us to think about how the two stories relate to each other. What do they have in common? In the case of those stories in Mark 5, there's several things they have in common. First of all, they both involve women. In the second place, they both involve a time frame of 12 years. If you remember the details, the woman has had this hemorrhaging problem for 12 years, and Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. Both of them, by virtue of their condition, would be unclean according to the law. In the case of the daughter, illness and then death. And in the case of the woman, this bleeding problem. Another thing they have in common is both situations seem hopeless. Which brings us to the most important thing they have in common, which is Jesus brings hope to situations that were hopeless by healing the woman of her hemorrhaging issue and by raising Jairus' daughter from the dead. So this morning I've asked you to turn to Mark chapter 14 because it has another set of interconnected stories. Mark 14, you'll see the bread, the outer layers in verses 1 and 2 and then 10 and 11. Here's what Mark 14:1 says. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Then the other piece of bread is in verses 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. These are ugly stories. Conspiracy, bribery, treachery, murder. But sandwiched in between this ugly story is a beautiful story that starts in verse 3. And while he was at Bethany. Bethany is a village just a couple of miles outside of the city of Jerusalem on the other side of the Mount of Olives. It's the home, you may remember, of Lazarus and Martha and Mary, who, by the way, may be the woman unnamed here in Mark based on the parallel accounts. Here in a few months, a bunch of people are going to come in from out of town to attend the lectureship at Florida College, and many of them are not going to stay right in Temple Terrace. They'll stay with friends or family sort of on the outskirts, just a few miles away. And that's exactly what Jewish pilgrims to Jerusalem for the great holy days would do as well. And it was Jesus' custom to stay here at Bethany when he came to Jerusalem for one of the appointed feasts. This story, though, doesn't take place at the house of Lazarus. It says in verse 3, it takes place in the house of Simon the leper. Simon, of course, is a very common Hebrew name. And so Simons had to be distinguished from one another. And there were a couple of ways in the first century they would do this. Sometimes they would do it on the basis of the name of your father. So, for example, Simon Peter is also called Simon Bar Jonah. He's Simon, son of Jonah. But sometimes they would be identified by a distinguishing characteristic, like Simon the Zealot, or in this case, Simon the leper. Presumably, former leper, since if he was currently afflicted with leprosy, he would not be permitted under the law of Moses to host anybody. He would, of course, be excluded from the community. If I had had leprosy, and then I had been healed or I recovered, I'm not sure I'd be so thrilled about always being known as Simon the leper. Like I had chicken pox when I was a little kid. I would not still want to be called Shane the chicken poxer haver. You know, that's just, I've moved on. We're past that. I don't want to be stigmatized by that unless Jesus healed him. And Simon here is known to the people Mark is writing to. And if that was the case, that wouldn't be so bad. In fact, it'd be kind of cool to be identified by the disease that Jesus healed you from. And maybe, who knows, that's the past history that explains why Jesus is visiting and eating with him. Well, verse 3 goes on to say, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. And if you're like me and you have no idea what nard is, here's what I looked up and found. Many of you are into essential oils, and that's basically what nard is. It is an essential oil. In fact, maybe some of you can tell me later today, there might even be an essential oil that's called nard or spikenard or something like that. This particular nard, based on the language Mark uses, is imported from far away. It comes from India. And therefore, it's incredibly expensive, very costly, as he says in verse 3. And just like fancy perfumes and colognes sometimes come in very ornate decorative bottles, this expensive oil is contained in a special flask that is made from alabaster. Quite beautiful. Commentators suggest that because of the tremendous financial value of this oil and of this container, that this most likely was a family heirloom that had been passed down. Which makes the next phrase astonishing, because verse 3 goes on to say, she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Notice, she didn't simply open it. She smashed it, which means this flask and this oil can never be used again, which tells us about her intentions. If she had simply opened the flask, we might have anticipated she would maybe use a few drops and then close it back up so that she could use more of it later on. But in this case, if you shatter a flask like this, then what that means is you don't intend to save any of the nard for future use. You're going to use it all right now at this moment, which is what she did. She poured it, the text says, all over Jesus' head. She's giving a gift to Jesus, and she's holding nothing back. She's giving everything, the exquisite bottle, the extravagant oil, all of it. And not everybody is happy about the enormity of this gift. Verse 4, there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. Now, almost certainly, the people that are described here are the disciples, based on what Jesus says in verses 7 through 9. And to be fair to them, it was customary around the time of the Passover, which you remember in verse 1 is the time frame here. It was customary around this time of the year to be mindful of the poor and to be charitable, just like we have seasons of the year, like Christmas, when you'll see the Salvation Army out and other charitable groups out who are taking donations for those who are poor. In their minds, this flask and this oil could have been sold for the equivalent of 300 denarii, which means 300 days' wages. That's an entire year's salary for the common worker. That could have helped a lot of poor people. Why would you waste it all at once on Jesus? Which, just saying that sentence out loud gives me the creeps. To use the terms waste and Jesus in the same breath. I mean, I get from a certain point of view why they are concerned about how much money is being poured out here. But it's the attitude, the indignation, the scolding. It's just bracing. And it earns an immediate rebuke from Jesus. Verse 6, but Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. Some of your translations say she's done a good deed or a good work, but the ESV says she's done a beautiful thing. Normally, we think of something as beautiful because it is physically attractive. Tomorrow would have been mine and Christy's anniversary, and she was a radiantly beautiful bride. The groom was, but the bride, she was absolutely spectacularly gorgeous. But you know, whenever I post a picture of Christy on social media, many of our other friends up in Nashville are quick to say she was beautiful on the inside as well as the outside. And she was. What do we mean when we say that? Somebody's beautiful on the inside. Well, we mean that they have a character that is attractive, as pleasing, as praiseworthy in a spiritual way as their outward appearance is in a physical way. By contrast, many of you, when your little kids were acting out, may have said, "You're acting ugly." Another description of character. Jesus says that what this woman did is beautiful. It is praiseworthy because it reflects her devotion to Jesus. And it is that devotion that is the basis of how Jesus appraises the gift that she has given to him. The value of gifts that are given to Jesus are not determined by the financial appreciation of what those gifts are. It's by the love the gift giver has for Jesus. And for those who treasure Jesus above all else, no gift, no matter how small, not even if it's the 2 mites of the widow, is insignificant. And on the other hand, no gift, even a year's salary, is too extravagant if it's going to Jesus because of your devotion to him. The key is, how much does Jesus mean to you compared to everyone else and everything else? Which is the point the Lord makes in verse 7. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. Now, to be clear, Jesus' point here is not, there's always going to be poor people, so you can just brush them off. Don't care about them. In fact, when Jesus says you always have the poor with you, your Bible may even tell you he's actually quoting a verse from the Old Testament. The verse is Deuteronomy 15:11, and he only quotes the first part of the verse. The rest of the verse goes on to say this: the poor you always have with you, therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother and to the needy and to the poor in your land. So the Lord's point is not to trivialize the poor, but it is to prioritize his death. Look again at the end of verse 7. But you will not always have me. We all know that when you make a budget, you have to prioritize. A long time ago, I was taught an acronym for priorities. WIN, W-I-N. What's important now? And what's important now, 2 days before the Passover, is Jesus' death and resurrection. The problem is the disciples don't grasp what's about to happen. They are oblivious, all except for Judas, of course, who's conspiring with the Jewish leadership, and he's doing that so he can get a payday. And that is the point of the intertwining of these stories. They are showing us contrasting perspectives in the way people value Jesus. There's the disciples. They think doing something elaborate for Jesus is a waste. They don't see Jesus as worthy of a gift. There's Judas. He sees Jesus at this point as just the meal ticket. There's the chief priests and the scribes, for whom Jesus not only has zero value, he has negative value. He's a liability that needs to be eliminated. But this woman, anonymous in Mark, not one of the 12, not even named, she sees Jesus as worth the best thing she could give and worth all of it. What about you? How much does Jesus mean to you? Is he too unimportant to make a sacrifice for? Or are you in it just for what you think you're going to get from him? Or do you want to get rid of him from your life? Or is he worth everything to you? And the reason he should be worth everything is because of what Jesus explains in verse 8. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. This is a profound statement. She is giving a gift to Jesus as if anticipating his death, anointing him for burial. As you know, the Jewish practice was not to embalm. What they would do is they would take the corpse, wrap it in linen that was packed with spices and oil and ointments. And Jesus says she has come beforehand to prepare my body for burial. Here's why this is so profound. It suggests that somehow she knows that Jesus is about to die, and none of the disciples know that. And it's not for lack of trying. Jesus in the Gospel of Mark predicts his death and resurrection 3 times. And the last time he did it, which is in Mark 10, after he tells them what's going to happen, the disciples have an argument over who gets to sit at the right hand and left hand at the kingdom. They are oblivious to the meaning and significance and even the inevitability of Jesus' death, because their priorities are so wrapped up in themselves, in self-centeredness. And they're not just confused now. After Jesus dies and the time comes to bury him, where are any of these guys? They are missing in action. Someone else has to bury him. But by contrast, this anonymous woman has discerned in some sense that Jesus is about to die. And she's paying respects to him. And it is her grasp of Jesus' impending death, a death which is so central to the gospel message, that explains why Jesus invests her actions with eternal significance. Look at verse 9. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Because this woman understood, however incompletely, that Jesus was going to suffer and die. And that's what the gospel is all about. Jesus says when people talk about what she's doing, they're going to be preaching the gospel. And because she understood that Jesus is worth everything we could give them, he's worth more than anything else. And that is central to the gospel. Whenever this story is told, the gospel will be proclaimed. And today, in our own very modest way, we have fulfilled the scriptures, just like Jesus said. Because he knew that his death and burial, which her actions are foreshadowing, would not be the end of his story, but the beginning of a story that would be told all over the world. And knowing even more than this woman did, as we gather together today, understanding even more about Jesus' death and burial and resurrection and value, then we have even more reason to live beautifully for him and to honor him above all as we take of the bread and the cup.